Hi everyone, this is Lao Wan reporting for 华尔街前线. Today, the Asia Society hosted a webinar to summarize some of the main economic conclusions from China's annual two sessions, where Premier Li Qiang set China's 2024 GDP growth target at, quote, around 5%. The panelists included Christopher K. Johnson, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is also the President and CEO of China Strategies Group, a political risk consulting firm. Also present was Ma Guonan, Senior Fellow on Chinese Economy at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. Also Jessica Chen Weiss, Senior Fellow on Chinese Politics, Foreign Policy, and National Security at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. Moderating the panel was Neil Thomas, a Fellow on Chinese Politics at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. First, to focus on some of the notable breaks with tradition. Premier Li Qiang will not do the closing press event, which Chinese premiers have traditionally done at the end of the annual two sessions. Previously, this had been one of the only opportunities for foreign journalists to ask questions of high-level Chinese officials. Moderator Neil Thomas said that this was a sign of Chinese President Xi's further consolidation of power, seeking to be the sole purveyor of China's economic vision. Thomas also added that though China declared it would be scrapping the traditional premier press conference for all future two-session meetings except in, quote, exceptional circumstances, that impetus to do away with the premier press conference may be linked to China's economic struggles. That was a point of agreement among all four experts on the panel. China's economy is in turmoil, specifically in the real estate sector and with flagging consumer spending. The experts also raised concerns about local governments' debts, a growing problem as local governments had previously obtained much of their revenues by selling land leases to development companies. As the real estate sector struggles and public and private banks become more reluctant to give loans to property development companies, it's unclear what this means for local governments' revenue. China declared 5.2% GDP growth in January, a number also used by the IMF, although the veracity of that figure has been questioned by experts both inside and outside of China. With Premier Li Qiang's declaration that China will be aiming for, quote, around 5% GDP growth this year, it would seem that the Chinese state feels confident in its economy. Private investors, both in China and abroad, have less confidence, feeling the impacts of low consumer spending and the flagging real estate market. When asked about the growing rift between the state's vision of the economy and private investors, Ma, a specialist on Chinese economic policy, explained that this was likely part of Chinese President Xi Jinping's plan to pivot to an economy driven by the tech sector, while allowing the real estate sector, which had previously been one of the main drivers of China's GDP growth, to shrink down to size. This is in accord with an IMF paper published in early February, which stated that, quote, more recently, the Chinese authorities have appropriately focused on containing the risks and helping the real estate sector transition to a more appropriate and sustainable size. Ma stressed that it was unclear how well the Chinese economy will adapt to this massive shift in emphasis, and that the state may need to intervene to prop up private investors' low hopes in the Chinese economy. Ma added that he expects to see more information about this in the upcoming third plenum. Christopher K. Johnson talked about the growing debt and funding crisis for local governments in China, positing that while many local governments were heavily in debt and struggling with revenue flow in the new cooling real estate market, they still held assets that would perhaps have to be sold. He raised the example of state-owned manufacturers of consumer goods like tobacco and alcohol, presenting a case study of the Guizhou government, which is heavily in debt but owns the most profitable baijiu company in the world. Johnson here is referring to the local government-owned Guizhou Maotai company, currently estimated to be worth 2.1 trillion yuan or almost $300 billion US, making it the world's 33rd most valuable company by market capital. To Johnson, it doesn't make sense for local governments to own these assets, and it may make sense to streamline the Chinese economy to privatize these companies. He sees a similar future for state-owned hotels, resorts, and other assets that aren't of strategic importance to local governments. it's unclear if local governments view things the same way. In a cooling real estate market, these assets may be their main source of stable revenue. Johnson added that he hopes China will implement a better fiscal system for state and local governments. Ma chimed in that China may need to find a longer-term solution for local government revenue issues, especially if Xi's plan is to cut the real estate market down to size. Ma described Beijing's current policy as one of, quote, kicking the can down the road and, quote, in the medium-term policy of buying local government bonds. Johnson stated that one of China's main problems for the future is the possibility that the modern production processes may not create as many jobs in the future. Johnson pointed to China's path to becoming the world's leading auto exporter, even as the number of jobs in auto manufacturing has remained roughly unchanged. This might mean that China will have to expand its jobs in the service sector, a shift that has happened in many developed countries that hasn't fully taken place yet in China. Johnson stated that China has much more room to grow in the service sector. When asked what China's domestic economic struggles might mean for its foreign policy, Jessica Weiss, expert on foreign policy at the Asia Society, stated that she did not see it making China more militarily dangerous or aggressive. China's policy would rather be to, quote, batten down the hatches and prepare for foreign economic and military conflagration, rather than initiate a conflict on its own. Weiss further added that China was also likely readying itself to be prepared for whatever outcome of the American election in November. With former President Trump pulling significantly ahead of Biden and Nikki Haley just announcing her withdrawal, China is likely preparing for a new round of Trump tariffs and a resumption of Trump's trade war policy by emphasizing economic self-reliance, especially in the tech sector. Thank you so much for tuning in, and look out for our upload of highlights of the Asia Policy webinar tomorrow. Once again, this is Lao Wan reporting for 华尔街前线.